Welcome to the second Digital Disability podcast. We're going to talk about a couple of films, The Peanut Butter Falcon and The Whale Box. And with me, as always, the great two doctors joining this lesser one is Alison Wilde and Miro Griffiths. So tell us a couple of lines about yourself, Miro.
So I'm Miro Griffiths. I'm a teaching fellow in disability studies at the University of Leeds. I have a particular interest in disability activism, social movements, how people establish resistance practices, and I obviously have a keen interest in film as well, but maybe as a layperson.
Okay, Alison.
Okay, I'm Alison Wilde. Obviously, I'm doing a mix of things at the moment, including some research on mental health, and I do some tutoring as well. I have a big interest in screen and disability, namely television and film. It's a big thrill for me to watch films like this, whether they're bad or good. I do work on other areas, but that's my main, media and disability is my main research area.
Excellent. And I'm Paul Darke. I did my PhD in disability and cinema, and I run a disability arts organisation in the Midlands of England. So let's get on with it. Which one shall we do first? Let's start with the Peanut Butter Falcon, a mainstream contemporary Hollywood film starring, what's his name? Shia LaBeouf and Dakota Johnson and Zach Gottsagen. Yeah. If I just give us a little rundown of the plot, basically it's about a guy with Down syndrome, a Down syndrome person, as he calls himself, who is in an elderly people's home, who escapes and ends up traveling by boat down the deltas of some American state, I've forgotten what it's called, to freedom and redemption along the line. It's a couple of hours long, I think. Yep, a couple of hours long. No, 1 hour 37. Directed by Tyler Nielsen and Michael Schwartz, and co-written with the Zach Gottsagen as well. So let's start with you, Miro.
It wasn't great. I wasn't that impressed with it. It was charming in a sort of Mark Twain storytelling. But it didn't really do much with regard to disability. With regard to engaging critically with disability issues, nor should it do. But again, the question is it problematic in its representation of disability? And I think there was some elements that were problematic for me in the representations of disabled people, particularly people with learning disabilities,
also which bits in particular.
So I was uncomfortable with this idea of straight away you had this disabled character who was going around asking people if they were friends. You saw that at the beginning of his journey as well, in terms of going up to those group of bullies and asking them if they wanted to be his friend. Of course, then I assumed that there must be a moment when Shia LaBeouf is going to come back and save him, which he did. So again, the non-disabled character has to save the disabled person. And also there was that bizarre issue with swimming as well. I thought, why is there a necessity to illustrate that this individual needs to be protected from the elements, and of course turns to the non-disabled person to do that. And also there was I don't know, maybe I'd be interested to hear what you and Alison think, but it was also that there was this line around people. He had to be extremely strong. And again, you see that in some depictions of disabled people in films. It reminded me of that awful portrayal of people with learning disabilities in Blazing Saddles, where you have an individual who has learning disabilities but is extremely strong and powerful. And yes, there's also Mungo. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and
I can't have you slagging off Blazing Saddles, one of the greatest films of all time, my man.
But on the one hand, you've got the extremely strong and powerful in terms of physical strength, but then is also quite submissive, and you see that particularly at the beginning of the relationship between Shia LaBeouf and Zach, in terms of being quite submissive, carrying all his equipment and so on as an appreciation or thank you for him saving him on his journey to the wrestling academy.
And it's never problematic. That's the point, surely, because actually there's nothing wrong with having a character who may be physically strong, but actually, if you're trying to be fairly accurate, it would occasionally be problematic in what they do together physically as well. And of course, it's never problematic on that side, but it is beneficial on that side, and only it's a one-way street. Which
and also don't forget the. When they started their journey, I thought there's got to be a moment where there's a character with a visual impairment who's going to be enlightened and see into their souls, and of course you get that with the person with the house that they stumble across and have a strange baptism in the middle of the film, which was equally bizarre from my perspective.
Alison.
I missed about a minute of that. It went silent.
He was just talking rubbish, so it doesn't really matter.
Right, okay. It came back when we were talking about Blazing Saddles, but I don't know what you said for that, but we'll brush over that. I think you're both a bit harsh, actually. I didn't want to go see this film. I was put off by the title. I saw it some while ago, actually. I was put off by the title, so I decided not to go see it. And then I wanted to go to the cinema because I felt a bit rubbish when I was out, and that was all that was on, so I saw it. And I was actually quite impressed, given that I'd expected it to be really bad. I'd also forgotten that LeBeouf, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, to be honest, but anyway, I didn't know he was in it, and I was quite pleased because I like him. But I actually found it, given that I had very low expectations, quite good in several aspects. I agree with most of what he says, but particularly the blind man, actually, which seemed gratuitous and just repeating a tired old trope. But I watched it again because we were going to do this. I watched it with my partner. He liked it at first, and then he grew very weary of it. And I think that's partly because of the reasons you said. There was a lot of laziness in it, and I think one of the big problems he had with it was the fact that they just seemed to basically kidnap him at the end, and didn't bother us with how they all became a family. But I thought it was kind of good on some respects as well, and I thought. The thing that I find most, for want of other words, positive about it is the fact that we've got a really good person with learning disabilities in a key role, which is rare, if not, just not there. And I think the film was built around him, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But I did find one of the things I found most problematic actually was that kind of repeat of those kind of infantilizing special things about people with learning difficulties and Down syndrome in particular. The fact that the kind of idea that he should realise his ambition to be a wrestler is kind of a bit like the Make-A-Wish. Let's get this kid to Disneyland type of thing. So that was kind of quite problematic, but it would have been quite a dull film if it didn't kind of get there. So maybe they should have ended it when he realised that he wasn't up to wrestling, just before he went on to wrestle. So yeah, I generally think I'm glad it came out. I hate the title, and I don't like those things about it, but I do think it was a really good chance to see a disabled person acting and carrying the role off really well.
Well, actually, and I didn't really comment on it. I actually thought it was better than I expected it. I agree with you, Alison. I think,
Thanks.
Miro's often wrong, so no, he's never wrong. In this occasion, I think it was about accepting it for what it was. And again, it was, I think I mentioned last week, it's about watching the film you're watching rather than wishing it to be something else. I thought it had one really, really good moment, actually. that I'd not seen done anywhere else that I thought was quite exceptional, actually.
Yeah.
And that's the bit where Dakota Johnson, the main female, catches up with them on a beach by some delta or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's discussing the main character with Down syndrome, and he keeps putting his head underwater so that they can't hear, and it's a little thing so that they can have a little chat about him while he's doing something fun or whatever. And she says, well, he can't do this, we've got to do this for him, we've got to do this for him. And Shia LaBeouf says, stop calling him a retard. And she says, I didn't ever call him a retard. And he says, you didn't use the word, but everything you say indicates that.
Yeah.
And if you think about what she's saying and then the way he does that, that's actually quite a radical revolutionary moment within a popular mainstream Hollywood film on the treatment of people with learning difficulties, which I know Tom Pauling always used to go on about. Hollywood has some of the most radical ideas in it, hidden or subtly put into some of the most mainstream stuff. And actually that moment, and it isn't particularly negated by the narrative, in the sense that often you'll get a phrase like that, but the rest of it is kind of like disability inspirational porn that completely negates that. And I thought that line alone was so significant and so different from any other kind of representation that you've seen. I think one of the key problems for me with the film, and it's true with society, there was no issue of the elderly being in this institution. Who are disabled just by being elderly, and that kind of contradiction within society, that it's okay to bang up, literally in prison, certain sections of the community without any regard to kind of independent living, age being a primary one in my view. That I think it would have been strengthened if it had questioned, because it's often about films set in institutions, that dancing one with James McAvoy years ago.
Inside I'm Dancing.
Oh,
that's it,
worst
they don't actually, they're kind of like, well, there's certain disabled people who deserve freedom, but they never question the actual existence and the ideology of institutions. And this with that, just that one line, which I thought was so good. I was genuinely surprised. It is a cliched film. It is a fairly standard narrative. It is Huckleberry Finn. It is all of those things which tap into a kind of American psyche. So I thought it was much better than I expected, and that line really did transcend the banal in a way that I didn't expect.
It did, and the scene before that, I think it was kind of showing it was kind of encapsulating the strength of the relationship between them, which I thought was also quite a rare depiction of disabled masculinities. I mean, it was quite, I think it was quite honest in that there was an issue of power in there, and which kept being repeated by who's what's number one rule, that the non-disabled guy is in charge. But then at the same time, I think there's an element of reality in there, in that he has somebody who's newly escaped confinement and has been infantilized most of his life. He will be looking to somebody. So I think he handled those bits quite well in terms of looking at their relationship. But you were also talking about the kind of American some of the American cultural things that were going on there, and I do think it's worth mentioning that usually for a film of that type, the cinematography is not great, and the cinematography was actually pretty good in this film, I thought. I did get quite a lot out of that.
I agree, and I think being in isolation, the landscape looked fantastic, and I thought that was really good. But it's not that I disagree with Miro. I think you're right in everything you've said, but actually I think there were moments you could pick out that to make it more than it was, Miro.
No, absolutely, and I agree with you on the when he challenges Dakota on the issue of referring to Zach as a retard all but in name. But what I thought was interesting was that, before that you've got the example of non-tail people determining and discussing the future of the disabled character. Do we take him back to the place? Do you let him go? And then after you've had that discussion where Shia LaBeouf quite convincingly calls Dakota out for her views and practices in relation to Zach's life and his life choices. But then also it almost regresses because later on in the film he then has to lock Dakota in the car in order to stop her from interfering with Zach's interest in wrestling. So it just felt a little bit clumsy and messy, and I think I enjoyed aspects of the film in terms of the soundtrack, in terms of the cinematography. Absolutely agree with Alison's point. I think it was just problems with the storytelling itself, and whilst I acknowledge that I might be drifting into wanting it to be a different film, I just think there was some clumsy element in the way that it's told the story. Even I don't know, even to the there was it felt uncomfortable also in the sense of was Zach being an individual with Down syndrome and his character, was that used as a metaphor then for Tyler to reevaluate his life in terms of his misdemeanors and so-called deviancy? Was an opportunity for Eleanor to consider her view of what she wants from her life and also her working practices and so on, which then of course ends with them all running off to complete their dream to Florida. There's just those issues that I felt were a little bit messy and a little bit clumsy in the writing.
I would agree, Alison.
Yeah, no, I'd agree too, but I think it was weird in that there were lots of just like really you can't gloss over that moments, but at the same time they seem to have an idea of how to take some aspects forward. I thought,
yeah.
So,
And I thought again it's a difficult one because I think because in fact part of the whole publicity of the film is how it has changed Shia LaBeouf's life through meeting this Zach Gottschalk, in that Shia LaBeouf, and in fact he was arrested in the making of this film for being drunk and disorderly, and it delayed the making of it. And actually in meeting the guy with Down syndrome has made him reevaluate his entire life to get it back on track, etc.
Although, do you know much about his background? Because he has quite an interesting background. Was the film about him that came out last year? Was it?
Yeah, just before, wasn't there?
Oh, was it just before that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Right.
Yeah. And I think, but I think that is it. That is a cliche in itself, and I think part of the problem is so. For example, I've just done a chapter for a book on being in isolation. Actually, well, a chapter is about 800 words, about 60, 70 other authors, and talking about how this is an opportunity to reevaluate your life. And the problem with the reevaluating your life within this film is that it's within a narrow context of kind of like the American dream and a kind of normalization, which of course normalization does largely come from learning disability studies in the kind of late 80s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
But it's not about transcending the normal, and that's a problem for me. I don't think it has the capacity or the intellect to transcend the normal, but just about being a more civilized world in that, within that confines. I'm not sure I'm being that clear, but so I think it does make. So, for example, in that conversation with Dakota, whatever her name is that I was talking about, she does reevaluate her life and see the errors of her way in institutionalization for someone like him, but not within
the old people.
Not within its broader context, and that's the problem of it for me. That
Sure.
It takes one step rather than the 3 or 4 that it really could have done to be quite revolutionary, and I think, and that's I think that's at the heart of what you're saying, Miro, is that it goes a bit but not far enough, and it then ends up repeating tropes and cliches and stereotypes disability.
But I think Alison's point about analyzing the film from the concept of power is really significant, because you do see that you do see elements where Zach is perceived to be in a very powerful situation, but then equally you see the power shifting, and I think that's my issue. It is constantly flowing backwards and forwards, which is not a problem, but ultimately it ends with the fix of his life coming from the non-disabled characters deciding that we'll take him on the journey. They've fallen in love almost through his facilitation of his existence, but then it's a case of, well, we'll take you with us on our on our decision to continue our journey. So it starts with him being marked differently because he wants to get out of his institutionalization, and then through the film it feels like actually the main issue is his desire to have friends and have a family and have value. And I think also that issue of value and self-worth is quite fascinating, because his value and self-worth comes through a format of pretending, which of course is what wrestling is a form of pretending. But then also it relies upon once the central issue becomes his desire to have belonging, it then relies upon the non-disabled characters to facilitate that.
Yeah, so even in that notion of like having a family, it's not his own family, it's this pseudo-constructed one.
And I think that was really, because I thought another kind of standout point, which again it was just frustrating that it wasn't further developed in the script, was that recognition of him being abandoned by his family, and he assumes that being abandoned by his family means that he must be therefore the villain in his own story, in his own life, and then it's kind of brushed over again quite quickly. But I thought that was quite a poignant moment. That was a way to reevaluate why is it tolerated that we will abandon people and leave them to be warehoused in environments where there is a considerable lack of choice and control, but also where we deem it acceptable just to throw those who are seen as unproductive or unworthy of society.
Yeah,
Alison?
I agree. I mean, that's the moment that I was referring to when they were talking about, whether it was the hero or the villain and all that type of thing. I mean, I think to be honest, with in some ways there are problems that emerge that the film points at, which are hugely problematic anyway, in the way that we all treat people with learning difficulties in actually. In actually, well, what does liberation for somebody in his position look like? And I have heard, in kind of real life formats, people discussing, what people should, for want of a better word, be protected from, what they should be allowed to do, and what I don't know, what does that liberation look like for people with learning difficulties? How do we protect without actually disappointing, as they would have done if he hadn't got to wrestle, and allow them the opportunities that they want, that feel that they're normalised, despite our critiques of normalisation. So I think there's all sorts of problems anyway that are actually quite hard to solve, which it kind of begins a conversation about, even if it does then brush over them and make it all happy.
So in reality, there's a couple of key moments in there that are quite challenging and quite original to see in a mainstream Hollywood movie. Those two bits we just mentioned, which I think is fascinating that happened. So let's talk about the ending, both that he goes wrestling and then the bit after that. What did you think of the letting him wrestle kind of stuff? Was that not inspirational porn?
It was just stupid, really.
Don't hold back, Alison.
It's not a word I'd normally use. It was just silly. It was almost that moment that some films get to, where you think, oh, let's just finish the film.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like.
So I thought it was going to be worse than it was. So, for example, as he's about to throw him and the people come in to beat the guy in the head, I thought he was going to throw the person at them and then it wouldn't happen. So actually, that he did get his head kicked in, to use a paraphrase, was actually quite good in a way that it didn't double up on the stupidity of it. Miro?
No, I agree. It was for me. It felt inspirational porn. All that I think from the moment where his idol wrestler, who's given up on his life, given up his life of wrestling, then comes back dressed as a wrestler driving his car, which I thought was absolutely nonsense. I think for me, I thought the film should have, and perhaps it would have been too short, but they could have expanded the bits that we thought was quite significant. I thought it should have ended where they go and see the wrestler, his idol, and his idol actually doesn't do that life anymore and has no interest in that, and therefore then doesn't use his sympathy for a disabled person to then re-energize his interest in training people to be wrestlers. I thought from that point onwards, I thought that was the most problematic part of the film, and I think that kind of started to drag down the whole film then for me, to its end point, which I then thought was, well, I wasn't that enthusiastic of spending an hour and a half watching it.
It's funny because I agree with you both absolutely, but I would add a but. It being an inspiration is this is awful, and I'm ashamed that I'm saying it. If you have some kind of severe impairment, you are a valuable inspiration to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not, and it enables whole groups of people to get up in the morning.
Yeah.
I mean non-disabled people, and it did capture that a little bit in the sense that the wrestler had given up. His life was pretty shit. He was now a nobody.
Yeah.
But he still had something to offer. And I think the shame is that he didn't do it in a more intelligent way, and it just became this kind of crass, kind of ignorant, rednecky kind of thing, and the wrestling and the physicality of it. But then he also had that notion of, for example, the guy he did wrestle with had no problem about really hurting the person.
Yeah, that was good. I thought that was good.
and so there was a lot of mixed stuff in there. It wasn't coherent, and it didn't deliver anything particularly satisfying. But there were bits in it that you could see that it tried in that actually.
It did, yeah.
And so again, and it's kind of like I did. It was enough to kind of like not be too inspirational porny.
Yeah.
But it was as well at the same time.
Can I just say as well, just on that point, I thought it was quite interesting because if we go back to Shia LaBeouf, when he challenges Dakota Johnson, I think her name was, on that issue of infanticide, creating the infant of Zach. But then I thought that it just made me think about now when you were discussing the wrestling scene when Zach comes out dressed in that ridiculous outfit, made up of cardboard and tin, and even the wrestler is like, what, is muttering under his breath, what are you doing parading him like this? I thought that was quite significant. But it's almost like Shia LaBeouf has gone back on what he said about don't create the child out of Zach's experiences and his choice and control. And I just thought that almost like was Shia then falling into that trap as well in the way that he parades Zach en route to the boxing ring.
Yeah.
I agree completely, but wrestling is stupid. and actually he bought into that, which I think is just stupid and pointless, and it was almost like continuing to play the game, sort of. I'm not sure what I'm saying, but I agree. But equally, I think there was a bit more, that it was a bit more challenging than actually being pure porn. It was inspirational porn, and I'm not denying that at all. But I think what's interesting is that they originally wanted the Shia LaBeouf character to die, so that when they're driving off at the end, they go off together alone. Zach. and Dakota Johnson. They're just alone, but that was deemed too much for him to have died. I think that's quite interesting.
Oh yeah, I think I would have probably killed him off.
And that would have been a little bit better. I think the problem with the business of the industry, there's always the fear of a sequel, so you can't kill off the main character. So any other comments? Anything else from Alison?
No, I don't think so. I did think that the wrestler. I don't think wrestling's stupid. It's not my cup of tea, but I don't think wrestling's stupid.
No, but I meant stupid in the sense that it's about showmanship. It's not about.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting metaphor to use in this particular film, as you pointed out, Miro. But I was relieved for the second time to see the wrestler not having any mercy on him. I thought. But having said that, I think there were quite a few mixed messages in the film about the fact that the wrestler didn't do that. But maybe there's an element of class and intelligence going on there. But the other people didn't want to disappoint him, so went soft on him. So and in some ways, I suppose that's a reality of the lives of people with learning difficulties, is that they will get people who refuse to normalize them, and then they'll get others who compound all that. So it must be a very confusing, frustrating world to live in, to have so many people treating you in vastly different ways. And I think it captured that a little bit as well, actually.
I suppose the question is, just reflecting on what both of you are saying particularly about the wrestler in the ring. It's does he treat him in the way that he treats him in the film because he sees him as an equal, or does he see him as an inferior? Because I got the feeling that he was treating him. He wasn't being soft on him. He wasn't being protectionist around the brutality of the fight. Not because he saw him as equal, but because he saw him as inferior. And he calls him a retard. He makes reference to, this isn't a kind of a Make-A-Wish Foundation trip. So for me, it was a case of, I immediately thought, oh, this is interesting. He's not, the referee telling him to calm down, his mate saying that, calm down when you're fighting him. But then I just thought, well, yeah, but is it because he sees the person with a learning disability as inferior to himself, and therefore he feels that he can exert this level of dominance in the ring?
Isn't he just seeing him as a person and using the language of wrestling?
Yeah.
And just absolutely that. But I think one thing I want to talk about, one thing more actually, because Alison has reminded me, class. There is a big class thing between, say, the Dakota Johnson thing. There's a big thing made about that she's gone to a university, for example.
Yeah.
And kind of like Shia LaBeouf's kind of, more working class narrative. But equally, the Zach Goldstein character, Gottshagen, sorry, I'm terrible on names, is almost classless.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know what to say about it, but I thought that was interesting that the two primary ones were engaged in a little bit of a class battle.
Yeah.
That was indicative of their attitudes towards Zach. In the kind of educated middle class thing is institutionalization, what they can't do, and kind of like facilities to put them in.
And a gender battle.
Yeah, and the working class person was much more kind of like historically, say, more accurate in that, we were always just part of our community. We were different and marginalized in different ways, but actually that kind of working class acceptance was sort of revealed in a slight way, not excessively, as was the kind of middle class, upper class attitude as well. And I thought that was that. And again, there's things in there that you can take away that are really quite different from anything else I've seen.
Yeah. No, I think it's a step forward overall. That's my just we need to keep working on the stories that are told.
Absolutely. So anything else, Miro, on class?
No, I've been agreement with you. I think there was a general problem with the way they portrayed people from that particular geographical area. It was always it emphasized in their portrayal about this kind of sheltered, backwards area. Even when he goes and buys the food from the grocery store, and the person behind the desk is saying to Dakota, "You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen." The people he works with and everything. There was a real problem with the way they portrayed the communities in that area, I thought.
I would have thought for an American audience that was about class, and there's a lot of class stuff in there to do with American culture as well, So, but I agree with you. Anyway, let's move on to the Whalebone Box, directed by Andrew Cotting and featuring his daughter, which he described as handcrafted experimental film. It is very experimental, and it's the tale of a friend of his who's got a box made of whalebone. He was given it 30 odd years ago from a beached whale in Scotland, and it's about the journey to take it back to be buried on the beach where that whale washed up. That's it in essence, but there's loads of other stuff in there. I know you really like this, Alison, so I'll let you start.
Well, no, I think probably start with the bad things.
Oh, go on then.
But yeah, I do, and I am. What I will say to start with is I liked it so much that I am endeavouring to see all of his films out. A friend of mine did tell me how good he was, and I'd not caught up with it, and I'm trying to get my hand on every film that he's made so I can look at it further. And actually, I'll contradict myself and say that one of the things that I realised after the first 5 or 6 minutes is that it reminded me of something that a thing that I used to watch some years ago, films by Patrick Keeler, such as Robinson in Space, which I absolutely adored. So already there's that there, and then there's the fact that his daughter's in it. So I'll leave it there and let you start with things about the film and maybe, I imagine, the placement of his daughter.
Right. Well, I'll start because I've been watching his films since Gallivant, which is about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was a big fan of Gallivant. I think Gallivant was an exceptional film in its inclusion of kind of disability/learning disability that I thought was quite radical. I would say, I suppose the thing I would say is it's not a conventional film in any sense. And if you're not used to watching this, it will seem very difficult to watch unless you've had that, like you've talked about the Keeler films that you watched in the past, and there's others like Derek Jarman, and he mentions Derek Jarman particularly, all of those kind of things. And if you're not used to watching them, I think you'll think, oh my God, this is just shit, because it is very different. A lot of it's not in focus. You can't necessarily hear it all. There's different formats used, 8mm photographs, kind of archive. It's all thrown in there, and the audio is as important as the visuals, and in a way it's unfair to call it a film. It's actually a work of art that's exploring so many things. I think there is a problem with the work, in the sense, the latter work, in that I think my personal view is, in watching Andrew Cotting's films, it is an attempt to give his daughter, who has a learning difficulty, meaning and a kind of a value of existence via trying to give meaning and value to other things, like the whale box, returning it to the earth, about life, existence, death. Andrew Cotting, he has no religion. He is an existentialist by and large, he says himself in the various interviews. And I do have a problem with that to some extent, that it is about him, not her particularly. But again, that's perhaps me wishing it to be a different film. I think that there's too many things in it for it to be accessible. Why should any work of art be accessible to everybody? It doesn't need to be, and I don't even believe it should be. But actually, if you're going to do a kind of thing that you want to get out there, I think there is an issue of accessibility to the ideas and the content that makes it slightly problematic. Equally, I have a problem with outsider art and how that is used by non-disabled people. I have a big problem with that. And Andrew Cotting does see his daughter within that kind of narrative outside of art or art brute that I do see as incredibly problematic, given that, for example, disability art, which is kind of art by disabled people that has a kind of political consciousness to it and articulation, is being eradicated and destroyed by funders and the mainstream in preference for what it calls outsider art, which is that notion of the disabled kind of savant being closely linked to nature and innocence and all of those kind of things. And they're all deeply problematic issues that a film about that, to some extent, which this is, and he calls it an aesthetic, an atheist searching for signifiers, and they're just all over the place. And so I think that's deeply problematic. I really did like this film, and I think there's so many things in there that are really good. But I do have a core problem deep down about that element of it, particularly.
Can I answer some of that?
Yeah. So Miro, your turn.
Oh. Well, no, I'm happy if you want to respond first, Alison.
Is that okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. I disagree with some of what you say, although I do get the problem of outsider art and funding to artists and those structures. I think clearly you know as much about that as anybody does, and I think you're spot on with that. And partly your one thing that I've taken from that, I may be reading it wrong, is I can see how somebody like Curtin can be seen a bit like the way parents in disability studies do occupy rather a large place in disability studies, and I can see that that's can be problematic in several ways, all at the same time essential. The thing that I disagree with is that I'm probably going to quote you wrong here, so you can correct me straight away. You're I think it's a matter of reading. You're saying that he's kind of looking to her to make meaning of her for the audience, and I don't feel that at all with it. I actually do think, as I think some others do, that his daughter Eden he uses like a muse. She's his muse, much like Tilda Swinton was for Derek Jarman. So I don't think, I think, like I said, it may be an interpretive thing, but I think he wants to share with the world what he sees in his daughter, and I recognise what you say about the signifiers, but I don't see it in such. I don't feel there's a kind of use of it going on. I think the pride and love is that's shown is immense, and I think it changes the narrative completely. Even if I do agree with the fact that for some people this film will be inaccessible. I'll shut up now.
No, never shut up. But I would agree with you. I think he is doing that. But I think I'd probably say that's what I find problematic, in the sense that because he is doing that, he wants everybody to, like you say, see the love he has for his daughter so that they can have it as well. But I think it transcends that to be a kind of an attempt to validate the meaning of her existence, which, again, I don't necessarily have a problem with. But I think if he's an existentialist, there is no meaning in any of our lives. All life is pointless, and it doesn't have the politics to some extent to make it that much more powerful than that I think it could be if that was in there. One of the problems in watching his films for me is I don't believe in the mysticism and the kind of spiritualism and the not spiritualism in that kind of talking in the sense.
I think he called it the you mean things like what he called these in the Q&A called a sonic hauntology.
Yes, yeah. I to me I don't have any of that. And of course that is a problem in watching a film like that. Like even the kind of, he says, once he got the box and understood it, it has a power and a kind of mysticism. No, it doesn't. You're giving it that. And actually, I think it would be better to have an exploration of giving it that. And there's a lot of that attempt to kind of give meaning to things that have no meaning. And I include him doing that to his daughter as well, and to himself, and to the objects around him. And that isn't particularly existentialist to me. That's more of, he says he's searching for signifiers. There are no.
Before Miro speaks, can I just say very quickly that I think that this, even though I kind of get some of what you're saying, and I kind of both disagree and agree at the same time. Yeah. I think it's come at a particularly significant cultural moment in that it does bring up possibly ambiguous, but questions about the post-Anthropocene, and I think that's really quite significant at the moment. Although I didn't know that this was coming, obviously.
And what do you mean by that, Anthropocene?
Well, the kind of melding together within the film of her, of the people who are journeying, and of the human animal interactions, yep. And what we assume of them, how they're changing, where those might go. And I think that's, I mean, it's a coincidence, but for me that did actually, that kind of those kind of characteristics you're talking about, and that hauntology that he described actually did seem particularly profound at this in the middle of the COVID crisis, really.
Yep. Miro, you don't tend to watch films like this. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, this is new to me.
So as someone who's sort of seeing this kind of film for the first time, what was your take?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed the film, and I would be interested to have a look at his catalogue. What I thought was clear was the immense love and affection that he has for his daughter, and I think you saw that right at the very beginning when, although it's not his voice, but there's questions around the love for the person that his daughter is, and he even got and you see that in terms of the language and the meaning of the words at the beginning, almost like the love for the leaky body, the body that's not usually seen as being affectionate, the bodies that are usually disposable or disregarded, and I saw that as a reinforcement of disabled people. We should love disabled people, and we should question why we consider people to be intolerable or disgusting on the basis of how their bodies function and behave. So I thought that was kind of a really stark moment right at the very beginning. I think, and as an existential nihilist, I didn't buy into any of the kind of the mystical nature of the box or anything like that. But I think there was this question. The emphasis of the film for me was the importance of different levels of interpretation, and you saw that not just within his friends who were trying to make sense of the box, trying to make sense of their journey and the meaning of it, but you also saw that with what I think was audiences' interpretations. So you had a couple of people on just their voices, and I think, again, I might be wrong, but I think they were trying to make sense of what they were seeing, and they were asking questions about: is the gun real? Does the gun act? What is that? Is that an angel? Is that somebody who's trying to hunt something? Yeah. Where's the power? So it was, and again, you also have that clue when they're in the museum and that there's that reference to multivalency, and so it's a question that the different levels of interpretation in terms of what he has set out to make in terms of capturing what his daughter is seeing and making sense of, then is being produced through his interpretation. But then it also requires the audience, for you to listen to what the audience think of the interpretation, and then leaves you with your own position of trying to make sense of the story and indeed the meaning of it. And again, I think that comes back to the question of, is there meaning to be taken from it? And I think what the director is doing is he's leaving that up to you to decide whether you take meaning from it or not. And so that's what really stuck out for me. I mean, I've got other points, but
I'll shut in there. And I think that the thing in the kind of the museum where the voiceover talks about multivalency, I think that to me is the key bit of the film, that it explains what it's all about. I think, when we're reading books in academia and you're supposed to pick out that one phrase that captures the entire essence, that did that with that particular moment. And again, it is an exceptionally good film. I'm not criticizing that at all. I think
really funny as well was that with her in that gallery. I actually found it really funny.
I think but what about, I think
Paul, just come back on that. I think that is really key, that part, because what it also states is the way in which we occupy different positions at the same time. It got me thinking of almost kind of Foucauldian ideas of power in terms of the resistance and oppression can be experienced at the same time, and indeed for one to exist there needs to be the other position as well which we may occupy. So I thought that I absolutely agree with you that idea of how do we understand where we are, but also thinking about where we may also the other areas of our thought process or our interpretation, and how we may occupy those different positions in order to make sense of the totality of the experiences that we're having. And I think that was quite key as well in another part of the film, where they talk about the distinguishing between humans and animals, again linking into Alison's point. They talk about how do you distinguish between when they make sense of the whale, and they say, well, it's, the idea of death when it becomes when it's possible to kill a whale. And I thought that was quite interesting, particularly not saying that the film did this, but as a disability studies scholar, I then thought about, well, how do we distinguish between ourselves and each other? And actually, the idea of death is inherent within our distinction of ourselves, because we, of course, determine worth and value on the basis of who we decide to see as disposable and not. And of course, we see animals as disposable in a sense of some of us will kill them to eat them, and therefore their worth only comes from that. And I think it's similar for disability as well, in terms of we allow disabled people to exist on the basis of they may provide something to us, cultural signifiers, metaphors, or indeed limited examples of work. But at the same time, we can dispose of people when they're not seen to be useful. So again, I think those narratives, those lines of thought that were going through the film in terms of interpretation and trying to make sense of who we are and how we differentiate ourselves either from each other or from animals, I think is really key there.
So did you feel, though, that in the kind of experimental film genre that this was a good way to do that, and that it achieved that with a considerable degree of success?
I don't think it was, but I wouldn't describe it as an experimental film. It started out, it felt like that, but I didn't feel it was that experimental, but maybe working with different definitions.
Well, in the sense that it's not conventional. Let's put it. It's a non-conventional.
That's true enough. Sorry to be pedantic.
No, because I think experimental would be a lot more challenging than this. And this does have a fairly well-defined narrative, which a structuralist or a lot of experimental avant-garde films don't. So you're right to pick me up.
I mean, for me, it's one of my barometers is that, do I think about a film afterwards? And for most films, I finish watching it, turn it off, leave the cinema, and then don't really think about it ever again. But this made me think about it. I was thinking about it when I woke up in the morning, and I imagine I'll be thinking about it at least for the next couple of weeks. So in that way, it does challenge me to reflect on our idea of who we are. Are we in a permanent state of becoming? To kind of look at that new materialist perspective on understanding the world. Yeah, that sense of we are always becoming. I think that's what I will be thinking about. That's what I'll take away from the film. That idea of perhaps there is no beginning or end. The box mysteriously appears, and then of course they bury it, and then in the Q&A afterwards, you find out that the box then appears, I think, if I read it correctly, in a museum later on. Yeah. So it's always that sense of what I thought the director was doing was he was trying to emphasize that notion, that ontology of there is, the way to make sense of the world is that we are always becoming. There is no way to understand where we begin and where we end. And in fact, that also links into later on in the film as well. I thought when they talk about the awareness of structures and when we die, what does death provide us with? Well, actually, it still requires us to do something when we think about death, because death doesn't mean the end. It means that we are then reflecting on or being prompted by the notion of death to think about are we part of something bigger? Are we part of something grander? And of course, I think the key thing is that there's no answer to that, and I think that's what's really good about the film is it doesn't ram down the throat the idea of spirituality or ontology, as we've said. It leaves us out. You have one character, I think is his friend, who is deeply committed to the idea of the mystical nature. But when I'm watching it as an existential nihilist, I'm thinking, well, actually, the idea of death does prompt me to think about something, what I'm becoming. Yeah. But it makes me realize that I'm not part of something grander, and therefore for others it will do. And again, it's a dialectic that comes from that, the way that we need to continue discussing those ideas of interpretation and how we make sense of ourselves within the existing structures of society.
And also about the very nature of film, because he does use a lot of audio from very successful mainstream contemporary films like Sunset Boulevard, for example. And actually he's getting you to question what film is it at the same time, which I think is one of his strengths, is to get you to explore your notion of what you're actually watching and how it's constructed. And he often reveals how he's constructing it and playing with it, the nature of the image, the nature of the sound that goes with it.
It's also, I think, it's an attempt to make indistinguishable what is real and what is imaginary. So it's almost playing with those ideas of objectivism and the subjectiveness, or indeed idealism and the material, because you have this question of, well, do we directly interact with our imaginations and the intentions that come from our imaginations, or is there a need in order to explore the subjective nature of our ideas as a way to then find commonality and a shared experience with others? And I suppose that the significance that he places on his daughter in that question around objectivity and subjectivity is that his daughter is the gatekeeper. This is how I interpret it. She was the gatekeeper in terms of she allowed for that exploration of the imaginative and the questionings that come from determining, in this kind of forest area, which is not really, we've not really understood where that is. We've not really understood what the nature is, what she's hunting, if indeed she is hunting, what is she looking for. And I think that so therefore he places the significance of the daughter, and again we can question whether disability has a significance in that as well. That idea of, again, going back to Paul's point about kind of art brews, the uncloudedness around that's usually framed around those issues. The idea that his daughter is therefore the gatekeeper to that exploration of what is real and what is imaginary.
I think that was done marvelously, and I think you've articulated it very well, Miro.
I think he's articulated it excellently. But what I would say is that I again, coming back to the outsider art brute kind of notion, that I think, and again, if you read around the stuff and the kind of work that he does, his daughter does, and with him, etc., this notion of that kind of genre of art as people with learning difficulties, as having insight into the natural, into nature, into innocence, is a cliche in itself. And the problem with this film for me is it doesn't question that at all, in the sense that I know the multivalency kind of stuff allows you to interpret that, but I was left with the feeling that he has an absolute belief in that, which is a kind of a generalized view of people with learning difficulties that I think is unhelpful and unproductive.
But sorry, to play devil's advocate, I mean, that's kind of not on his agenda. His agenda, as he said, is to get his daughter on film. His own, more selfish agenda is that. But I think also, even though I would agree with you in refusing that kind of stereotype, at the same time, I think in some ways it's not particularly about people with learning disabilities being closer to nature. It's about us being further away from nature and forgetting it constantly forgetting that, constantly shoving that away. So in some ways, I think there is a slight case for. I know I'm kind of arguing something that's on fairly unsafe ground here, but I think there's a slight case for actually pointing out that some people with learning difficulties, not all people with learning difficulties, but some people with learning difficulties, like my sister was, for example, is so far away from the cultural world that we construct that binary then becomes, and that stereotype becomes doubly problematic, if you see what I mean. You see what I mean?
I do, and I agree. And I think, I suppose it's that whole note, like, we were talking about biodiversity, and often biodiversity excludes the variance within humanity. And that's a very, very big problem. How, the kind of biodiversity within humanity is gradually narrowing, literally day by day.
Absolutely.
And I think, there is that in there, and I don't have a problem within itself, but I think within that multivalency, there should have been an opportunity to question that a bit more within the narrative, as an artist, as Andrew Cotting is, than I think was there. But again, excellent film. I'm glad it was made. I think it says a lot, explores a lot. Any other comments from the pair of you, Alison?
There was, I don't know if you had this, Miro or Paul, but there are certain images that keep coming back to me from the film, and one of them, strange. I mean, that I imagine that kind of nearer to nature, magical quality is when she has the gun, for example, with the headdress on. But one that I keep remembering, and I never thought that I'd see such a beautiful image constructed of these things, given what our culture delivers up to us. But I remember us standing with a Zimmer frame looking out, and I just had chills. And it was just an extraordinary image, and just utterly beautiful. And it keeps coming back to me in those ways. I have to say, it's one of the it's probably the happiest 3 hours that I spent in the last month is watching that film and listening to Q&A. I did find it had a beauty to it, regardless of whether you like the more mystical, existential elements to the film.
Miro?
No, I think, well, the last thought I had was around, but yeah, just thinking about what Alison was saying about the images. One image that came to me was the image of the living whale when it was beached. And then obviously waiting for it to die and cutting it up. And I thought what was quite significant about that, again, from a disability studies critique, is that idea of necro power and individuals with power and authority determining what should happen to the individuals, and possibly through the inactivity that they take, they allow or determine who should die. Of course, that speaks a lot to the issues surrounding disabled people's community, and I thought that was mirrored in the life of the whale as well. In terms of you see it now in contemporary images as well, when you see animals that are struggling, in terms, for example, when a whale is beached, and it's the question of do you perpetuate its suffering by not doing anything and just kind of standing around and almost looking at it from a point of view of curiosity and voyeurism. And I thought there was some real resemblances between how they were exploring the significance of the whale and what that means in the context of the disabled people's community. And I think, again, just going back to that issue as well about disposable bodies and the kind of necro power, I thought another time that was reinforced was when they were taking the poems by Bunting. that idea of existence is seen as a problem. Every life is a crime, and again, it reinforced that question of how we see certain people's existence as being deviant, as being problematic. One could argue, in the case of the whale, therefore we have to then place resources on either trying to keep the whale alive or to do something about the whale, and eventually that becomes a commodity in the sense of creating art from it, and producing artifacts from the existence of the whale. But again, you can see that within the context of disability, in terms of questioning that whether certain people should be living and the burden that places, and even within the context of the coronavirus, you see that being played out in determining and rationing services. So perhaps the position of his daughter is to try to bring those two worlds together as a gatekeeper of that knowledge, of questioning how we see the curiosity of this of this creature in terms of the whale, and how we may think about ourselves either as individuals, part of a broad society, or as specific communities, and the way that we determine the worth of certain communities.
Brilliant. I think we'll end it there because we don't want to bore the listener too much, as we've done over an hour. So thank you, Alison. Thank you, Miro.
Cheers.
And listen to the next one.